Everyone loves to celebrate the pack, but they always forget the one wolf who left it, the one who walked alone, disappeared for years, and came back unrecognizable. Let me tell you something. People don't fear the pack. They fear the wolf that learned to win without one. And if you've ever felt like you don't fit in, good. That's the first sign you're built to outgrow everyone who doubted you. Isolation isn't loneliness. It's the deliberate choice to step away from distraction and step into your own potential. Most people confuse being alone with being abandoned, but the lone wolf understands that solitude is the birthplace of every meaningful transformation. When you choose to pull back from the crowd, you start hearing the thoughts you've been drowning out with noise, opinions, and expectations. That silence people fear is actually the laboratory where clarity is created and refined. It's where you stop performing for others and start confronting the truth of who you are and who you're capable of becoming. In a world obsessed with staying busy, the lone wolf chooses to get effective instead. And the moment you realize that focus requires space, you stop apologizing for protecting your isolation. Because solitude isn't a punishment, it's the environment where real change finally becomes possible. Most people never discover their real potential because they never give themselves enough quiet to hear their own ambition. They stay surrounded by chatter, comparison, and constant digital noise that drowns out their instinct for growth. But when a lone wolf steps back, they strip away all the influences shaping them without their consent. That's when their goals stop being inherited from society and start becoming self-directed. They begin to notice patterns in their behavior, strengths they've overlooked, and weaknesses they've been avoiding. And that kind of self-awareness can't be bought, taught, or outsourced. It's earned through intentional isolation. The lone wolf isn't running from people. They're running toward a version of themselves that can only be built in solitude. And once that awareness sharpens, their decisions sharpen with it. Isolation creates the mental space required to build something meaningful without the pressure of external timelines or opinions. When you're alone, there's no one to impress, no one to compete with, no one shifting your priorities with their preferences. That freedom to operate without observation is a superpower. It lets you experiment, fail, and adjust without the fear of judgment that paralyzes most people. In solitude, every failure becomes feedback instead of embarrassment. Every iteration becomes progress instead of a public performance. And because the lone wolf isn't performing for an audience, the work they produce is more authentic, more aligned, and ultimately more sustainable. They're not driven by what looks good, they're driven by what works, and that distinction is what separates long-term winners from short-term imitators. Creativity flourishes in isolation because there's no competition for your attention. Most people are overloaded with stimuli, notifications, conversations, demands that fracture their ability to think deeply. But the lone wolf intentionally removes everything that dilutes their cognitive bandwidth. They understand that real breakthroughs require uninterrupted thought and unfiltered imagination. When you're alone, you stop thinking in fragments and start thinking in full concepts. You make connections you couldn't make in chaos. You generate ideas that aren't influenced by trends or groupthink. And that originality is what gives lone wolves their edge. They build, refine, and innovate from a place of internal power rather than external pressure. And because their ideas are born in quiet, they emerge sharper, bolder, and more resilient. The outside world often misunderstands the lone wolf's retreat, assuming it's withdrawal or insecurity. But the truth is that solitude is the ultimate act of self-respect for someone committed to growth. It's choosing long-term identity over immediate approval. It's prioritizing personal evolution over social maintenance. And it's acknowledging that you can't become exceptional while constantly being available to everyone. The lone wolf understands that isolation is not a state of weakness. It's a strategic choice. It's the time when their focus intensifies, their standards rise, and their vision expands beyond the limitations of the crowd. And once you've tasted what you're capable of in silence, you stop seeking permission and start creating momentum on your own terms. Most people exhaust themselves chasing validation because it gives them a quick, predictable hit of approval, but it never builds anything real beneath the surface. The lone wolf understands that validation is a trap. It keeps you dependent on reactions instead of results. When you detach from the need to be seen, you begin to operate with a different level of intention. You focus on what you're becoming instead of how you're being perceived, and that shift changes everything. Mastery requires repetition, boredom, and the humility to be bad at something long before you're great at it. But you can't endure that discomfort if you're performing for an audience. That's why lone wolves intentionally remove themselves from environments where approval becomes the reward. They choose to measure themselves against their own standards instead of the world's spotlight. And in doing so, they build a level of competence that validation could never create. Chasing validation keeps people stuck in a loop of impression management, constantly adjusting who they are to match who others expect them to be. Lone wolves break out of that cycle because they aren't trying to impress anyone. They are too busy improving themselves. They know that when you care too much about being accepted, you end up diluting your potential to stay comfortable. Mastery requires the courage to look foolish in the early stages, and validation seekers can't tolerate that vulnerability. Lone wolves embrace it because their identity isn't tied to performance. It's tied to progress. They understand that competence compounds quietly, without applause, without recognition, without anyone cheering them on. And while everyone else is focused on appearing successful, the lone wolf is actually becoming successful through deliberate, disciplined practice. That's the difference between superficial growth and real transformation. Validation seeking creates inconsistency because your motivation becomes dependent on how others respond to you. If people praise you, you push harder. If they don't, you slow down or stop. But mastery doesn't tolerate inconsistency. It demands commitment that doesn't rise or fall based on feedback. Lone wolves build that internal drive because their work is fueled by purpose rather than praise. They show up whether they are inspired or invisible because the reward is who they're becoming through the process. They understand that mastery is a long game with no shortcuts, and most people quit long before they reach their potential simply because no one is watching. But when you operate without an audience, you build endurance that others can't match. You learn to create momentum internally instead of borrowing it from external approval. And that internal momentum is what ultimately separates those who peak early from those who grow relentlessly. The lone wolf becomes unstoppable because they anchor their identity to skill instead of perception. They train when no one cares, they refine when no one notices, and they execute when no one supports them. Over time, the gap between them and validation seekers becomes impossible to ignore. While others fluctuate based on public response, the lone wolf becomes increasingly consistent, increasingly capable, and increasingly confident in their own ability. Mastery gives them a level of self-trust that validation could never provide because it's earned through effort rather than granted through approval. That self-trust becomes their competitive advantage. It frees them from needing to be understood, accepted, or applauded. It allows them to take bigger risks, pursue bigger goals, and maintain higher standards. And by the time the world finally notices their competence, the lone wolf has already built a foundation so strong that no opinion, positive or negative, can shake it. Most people crumble long before the finish line because they rely on motivation, which is unstable, emotional, and easily disrupted. By life, the lone wolf wins by removing motivation from the equation entirely and replacing it with discipline, which doesn't care how you feel. Discipline is predictable. It gives you structure when your emotions can't be trusted. It forces you to show up on the days when enthusiasm disappears and doubt becomes loud. Lone wolves build routines that work even when they don't want to, and that consistency compounds into results that look like talent from the outside. They understand that the difference between average and exceptional is often just the willingness to repeat boring actions for an uncomfortably long time. Discipline is their insurance policy against procrastination, hesitation, and fear. And because they commit to the process without needing constant emotional reinforcement, they outlast people who might start faster but finish weaker. Most people want quick wins because they're impatient, and impatience makes them quit when progress slows down. Lone wolves expect progress to be slow, and that expectation protects them from discouragement. They assume the journey will be harder, longer, and messier than they imagine, so they're not rattled when challenges appear. They build a relationship with struggle instead of avoiding it, which gives them a mental toughness others simply don't develop. When others hit resistance, they interpret it as a sign to stop. When lone wolves hit resistance, they interpret it as a sign that they're on the right track. Their discipline isn't reactive, it's proactive, built on non-negotiable commitments rather than emotional preferences. And because they anchor their actions to standards instead of outcomes, they keep moving even when progress isn't visible yet. This is why they survive the seasons that discourage everyone else. Endurance becomes their silent advantage. Discipline also gives lone wolves the ability to operate without external accountability. Many people perform only when someone is watching, or when they risk disappointing others. But that kind of accountability is fragile. Lone wolves do the work even when no one will know whether they did it or skipped it. They don't need reminders, applause, or deadlines to stay consistent. They've internalized their standards so deeply that not meeting them feels unnatural. Their integrity becomes their personal coach, pushing them when others would drift. And because they rely on themselves instead of external systems, they develop an independence that compounds into confidence. The more they follow through, the more they trust themselves. The more they trust themselves, the more ambitious their goals become. They create a feedback loop of responsibility and power that most people never experience. And by the time others realize the value of self-accountability, the lone wolf is already far ahead. While the world obsesses over speed, lone wolves obsess over staying power. They know that success rarely goes to the person who moves the fastest. It goes to the person who refuses to stop when others do. They build habits that can survive bad days, bad moods, and bad circumstances, which makes their path to mastery inevitable. When setbacks hit, which they always do, the lone wolf doesn't collapse or start over. They adjust and continue. Discipline gives them the resilience to stay committed when results slow down, and the patience to refine their strategy instead of abandoning it. Over time, this creates a momentum that becomes almost impossible to disrupt. What looks like grit or willpower from the outside is simply a lifestyle built on non-negotiable consistency. And in a world where most people quit at the first sign of discomfort, the lone wolf's ability to out-discipline the competition becomes the very thing that guarantees they eventually rise above everyone who started with them. Lone wolves understand that the most powerful work is done far away from attention, and that silence is a strategic advantage, not a setback. When no one is watching, there's no pressure to perform, no expectations to meet, and no criticism to navigate. That freedom allows them to take risks others avoid because they're too afraid of judgment. They experiment, fail, refine, and evolve without an audience interpreting every move. In the dark, their progress is uninterrupted, unfiltered, and unpolished. Exactly the environment where real breakthroughs happen. People often assume nothing is happening because they can't see it, but the lone wolf knows the truth. The most important growth is invisible before it becomes undeniable. So they stay quiet, keep building, and refuse to announce every step. Their silence isn't secrecy, it's strategy. Working in the dark also protects the lone wolf from noise that dilutes focus and weakens ambition. Most people talk about their goals because talking gives them the illusion of progress, and that illusion is dangerous. Words become a substitute for action, and applause becomes a substitute for effort. Lone wolves reject that completely. They know that every conversation about their plans leaks energy from the execution. Instead of seeking encouragement, they create momentum through discipline and follow through. They learn to love the grind precisely because no one sees it. That privacy becomes their shield, allowing them to pursue goals that are too big, too unconventional, or too misunderstood for the crowd. They don't need people to believe in them. They need to believe in themselves, and that is exactly what grows in silence. The world often misinterprets their quiet nature as lack of ambition, but the lone wolf knows it's the opposite. Silence is a signal of deep obsession. They're not disengaged from their vision, they're fully immersed in it. While others talk about balance, lone wolves talk about alignment. Their lifestyle, habits, and routines orbit the goals they've chosen, and they eliminate anything that competes for their energy. That kind of single-minded commitment is rare because it requires sacrifice most people aren't willing to make. It means saying no to distractions, stepping away from crowds, and ignoring trends. But the payoff is extraordinary clarity. When you're not dividing your attention among 1,000 competing voices, your path becomes sharper, straighter, and easier to execute. And because they've invested years into this internal alignment, the lone wolf's results eventually speak louder than any words ever could. This quiet consistency is what allows lone wolves to emerge with results so significant they seem sudden, even though they were anything but. By the time the world finally sees them, they've already done the hard part. They've endured the doubts, the boredom, the setbacks, and the years of being underestimated. What looks like overnight success is just the moment the results become visible. This is the irony of the lone wolf's path. People don't notice the journey, only the impact. They don't see the nights of repetition, the days of solitude, or the quiet battles fought behind closed doors. But the lone wolf doesn't need them to. They weren't working for credit, they were working for competence, and competence speaks in a language even silence can't hide. The lone wolf wins because they understand that success isn't a performance, it's a preparation. They spend years sharpening skills, refining their mindset, and building resilience that isn't dependent on validation or applause. And when their moment comes, they step into it with a level of readiness that shocks everyone else. The world sees confidence. The lone wolf sees preparation. The world sees effortless execution. The lone wolf sees years of invisible repetition. And the world sees success. The lone wolf sees the natural consequence of disciplined solitude. By the time anyone realizes how powerful they've become, it's too late. The wolf has already built something that can't be undone, underestimated, or ignored. In the end, the lone wolf rises not because they were lucky or gifted, but because they were willing to thrive where others refused to go. They embraced the dark, trusted the process, and stayed consistent long enough for mastery to reveal itself. And when they finally step into the light, they arrive with a quiet dominance that makes everyone else wonder how they did it. But you and I know the truth. They did it the same way all real winners do, through patience, discipline, and a commitment to growth that never needed permission. That is why lone wolves always win in the end.